Hey, Shepherd family. This is Pastor Scott Seidler. So excited for another installment of our Shepherd podcast. Today, I'm joined by one of my good friends from my time back in St. Louis, Matt Miller, who now serves as the executive director of Send Me St. Louis, one of the mission arms of an agency in St. Louis called the Lutheran Foundation. The Lutheran Foundation is known for over the past, 30 some odd years, channeling some $200 million into the nonprofit community of St. Louis, Missouri, trying to increase volunteerism, social activism with a Christian slant. And I'm so glad that Matt can join us today to share some insight on Christian volunteerism, what he's seeing in the church as we move through this pandemic time and reframe the way that we are engaging our communities. This is going to be a great podcast. I really do hope you enjoy it. Hey, before we launch in, let me again just orient you to our shepherd.family website, where you can find other podcasts that we've done in the past, and also a ton of other resources for your Christian development, your Christian growth, as together we learn what it means to follow Jesus. That's our mission here at Shepherd Scottsdale, is to lead people to follow Jesus, and our Shepherd podcasts are part of that. If you have the opportunity and are so inclined to become part of our financial support team, you can also find out how to offer your financial generosity through our shepherd.family website. It's easy to figure out. Just follow the links that are there on the homepage. Well, hey, Matt, welcome to our Shepherd podcast. How are things in St. Louis these days?
Hey, we're hanging in there. Like most, it's a combination of overlapping crises with glimpses of God's grace and trying to figure out a new rhythm as we move through it. So yeah, St. Louis is doing well. The heat is starting to cool down to 85, so we're doing okay. I guess talking to you though in Arizona, that's not that bad.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we have been 50 plus days or so with 110 degrees or hotter, if you can believe it. Now It's a dry heat, but so is a pizza oven. But we finally broke, and Renee and I, my wife Renee and I, were just saying that these past two mornings of walking the dog here have been just great. I love how you put it, navigating crisis and yet living out the grace of God. What was that phrase you just used?
Overlapping crises, but also getting glimpses of God's grace in the midst of that.
Yes, I love that. That is my new mantra. Overlapping crises, but catching glimpses of God's grace. We could stop the podcast right now, and that would be pure gold. Shepherd, if you're listening, that's what we want to do. In the midst of overlapping crises, how do we endeavor to catch glimpses of God's grace? That is so awesome. Well, one of the things I know, Matt, is just in the last few days, in your very own neighborhood, you have had and you've experienced a pretty significant crisis and had to be really on the lookout for God's grace through it all, because in your neighborhood, Officer Tamaris Bohannon was shot and killed just the other day, and it was literally right down the street from you. How are you and your family faring, and how are things going in St. Louis in the midst of all of this unrest, especially as it affects and is experienced in our police forces?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of, we're shaken and the neighborhood is shaken. It's a traumatic event. So the family that lives in this home where there was a man who kind of barricaded himself in a home and shot and killed a police officer from that home. Those are friends of ours. We've been in the house since he kind of holed up in there. And so it's traumatic. It comes in the middle of a summer in St. Louis where homicides are spiking, like a lot of cities across the country. So the brokenness and the weight of sin, it just feels heavier than it normally does. And I think people, Christians and non-Christians alike, it's just heavy. Yeah. Now, in the midst of that, watching relationships be birthed out of crisis and watching the body of Christ and the local church in our neighborhood respond, it's a reminder that we can't look to the world for our hope, that we serve Jesus, who is still on the throne, and we belong to a different kingdom. So it's this weird, horrible thing that happened, but it does bring you to your knees in a different way of realizing, oh, my hope can't be in just perfecting my neighborhood or having just safety. That can't be
Right.
it. So it's a whole mix of things, but it's definitely rocked some folks and shaken us.
Wow. I sometimes think of sin. When we talk about sin in the Christian church, I think of sin as displacement. It's a geographic concept. God is over there. Sin and separates me from God. You talk about sin being burdensome and weighty. In other words, sin is an object that pushes us down. I love that image. And I think all of us feel these days the weight of sin more than the displacement of sin. We certainly can't wait to get to heaven, which is our home. But right now, what we are really trying to realize is Jesus' words in Matthew's gospel, "Come to me, you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest for your souls." We're like, yes, please relieve the weight, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting. The phrase is, I've in my work with pastors all over our city, as homicides have increased and there's just different trauma happening all over the region, I've been using the phrase, it's from the Bible, but creation is groaning for liberation. And it just feels like the volume of groaning and the churning and the raging is louder. Yeah. And I'm hearing it more. Now, I think God's grace rises up in the midst of that, but it definitely is a different volume.
Yeah, that's so good. What that makes me think of is, in our very partisan and divided country, everybody's got a little bit of the truth. Everybody's a little bit right, those that want law and order, those that want equality and justice, everybody's got a little bit of truth behind their advocacy. But at the same time, what everyone shares universally is that in pursuit of that truth, in pursuit of what is right, there is that underlying and shared groaning, and I want the Christian church here at Shepherd Scottsdale and our Shepherd family to be a place where we can groan together. And even though in terms of diversity, you may have this, area of advocacy, you may have this impetus of political action that's different from mine, but we all together look at this world in its many parts. And man, I love that image, Matt. We groan together, and therefore church is a place where, while groaning together, we can also encourage one another, even if we disagree. Talk a little bit about living in St. Louis, a city that has a significant racial past. And just talk a little bit, because you and your family, you've chosen to live more toward the urban center of St. Louis. I mean, and that's a phenomenon that's kind of happening not just in St. Louis, but in other areas of our country, other cities of our country. Just talk about your experience of that racial reality that is confronting us right now.
Yeah, it's been an interesting summer. With the death of George Floyd, things have clearly, the conversation in St. Louis has been happening for a while. Back in 2014, with the death of Mike Brown, we had a lot of work done in this space, and George Floyd has opened some of that back up. And so what I've been doing a lot this summer is doing a lot of reading, both about just the racial history of St. Louis and our country and racism in the church. And it's been fascinating to learn about the story that I didn't know existed. When I look at St. Louis, there's a whole narrative behind the scenes of why it is the way it is, and where people live and where they have moved, and why certain people can live in places that they can't live in others. And so living where we live, our house has essentially doubled in price in 6 years. Wow. And so it's like living in the middle of rapid gentrification while at the same time watching historic rates of homicide tick up. And so you're living in a very disorienting time of great trauma and crisis, but then also great progress. And trying to reconcile those two worlds is hard. And St. Louis is just a place where you have two worlds very clearly on display of great progress and prospering, but then also people stuck in chronic poverty and systems of injustice. And so how do we as a family, how do we as the church live in that and not become fatalistic or discouraged, but also not just think it's all about progress for a few. How do we pursue an equity position on that? So yeah, St. Louis is a fascinating place to live and live this out.
Right. Right. In St. Louis, for those of you who may not know, you went to the Arch when you vacationed there, but you really don't know how it's all set up, right? You've got North County, South County, West County, Mid County, City, because St. Louis City is different from St. Louis County. That's a whole nother story. And then you got the boonies, which doesn't include necessarily across the Mississippi River in East St. Louis of Vacation with Chevy Chase fame, by the way. I mean, so you've got a very diverse metropolitan area. Matt, you grew up and were raised out in West County, right? In the Lutheran Church at Concordia Kirkwood, where I served as pastor. And just give a little bit of an ethos building moment here. Give a little bit of a story of how you got to where you are today as the executive director of Send Me St. Louis, tasked with coaching, consulting, and helping churches and other nonprofit agencies connect with a spirit of volunteerism in meaningful ways with their local community. How did you get back to St. Louis? Through Chicago, et cetera, et cetera. Just kind of fill in that little narrative.
Sure, yeah. Born in Chicago to Lutheran school teachers, lived there till high school when we moved to St. Louis, when my dad took a job to a Lutheran high school here. So yeah, Lutheran educated through and through undergraduate. Ended up still living in Chicago and got connected to a ministry called Young Life. And so was thrust into this non-Lutheran, multi-denominational world and realized the kind of the diversity of the Christian movement. Lived in Chicago, worked in higher education at Concordia in Chicago, but began to develop a love for community development, how communities are laid out and how they work well or don't work well. Also developed a passion for organizational dynamics and leadership, and again, how does that work well or not? And then a growing love for the church. And so pursued degrees in organizational leadership and then ultimately a Master of Divinity, and did not know how all of these strands would come together of local community, organizational nonprofit development, and the local church. God kind of wove those back together as we came back to St. Louis to be in this position of saying, how does the church engage the neighborhood? How does the church incarnate Christ in the community? How do we mobilize people, free people to engage out of their giftedness? So only God, and Scott, you were part of that, of getting me into this role at the foundation of really just getting to walk with pastors and leaders to say, hey, what's the vision that God has given you? And let's point you towards this deeper level of engagement. So yeah, so we've always had one foot firmly in the Lutheran space and then some broader engagement, which kind of broadens our view of options and ways to engage. So that's a bit of our story.
Yeah, I love it. And there's generations, right? And every generation, whether you're a war generation or a baby boomer, a Gen X like myself, you're a millennial, right? And you live at least in that generation.
Yeah.
And one of the things I really have always appreciated about you is if there is any millennial I want to be when I grow up, it's Matt Miller. because you come with such sophistication, and that's not a snooty word, but it's just an awareness of your generational moment within the context of really high-level organizational academic understanding of theology, organizational systems, nonprofit development, and then you pair that with the experience in the church as the son of essentially Lutheran school teachers. I mean, it's a rich history that God has provided for you. Talk a little bit, I'm just interested, the reconciliation of, growing up in the system and now working beyond the system, but also in the system to change the system. I mean, what are you learning? What has been your experience over these, 8 years of being with the Lutheran Foundation?
It's interesting. I was asked the other night, I was asked by somebody that's very much in the system, who is being a little discouraged by the system. And he said, Matt, how have you maintained your positivity about it? And I never been asked that question before. And I thought back kind of the past 6 years. And I think one of the key things for me is knowing that the church is bigger than the system.
Yes.
And
So good.
I long for the Lutheran Church to be deeply engaged, but I also know that God is at work in a lot of different ways. And so I think God has always had us connected to different communities, which I think gives me the ability to both engage deeply with our LCMS Lutheran community locally, but also know there's other folks that are in the kingdom with us. So I think that's helped me keep all of these systems and categories in check to some degree.
Yeah, I love first of all, I love the phrase, let's just return to that. The church is bigger than the system. Another pearl of wisdom. We could stop the podcast right now. Overlapping crises, glimpses of grace. Church is bigger than the system. Sin as groaning, sin as burden. Okay, man, you just keep preaching, brother. And we said a half hour for this. We're going to go for 2. Anyways. I love the church is bigger than the system. And, it makes me reflect because I too have a positivity about ministry, about God's activity in this world. And as you were saying that, it causes me to remember, I think part of the positivity that I have is that I've got my hands in a number of different pots of honey, Winnie the Pooh reference. And therefore, if one pot of honey tends to be somewhat spoiled, the great thing is there's 3 other pots of honey that I can go dipping my hand into. And I can't help but wonder if when I talk to pastors who are beleaguered and really under the weight of pessimism and, gosh, just get me to retirement so I can collect a pension, and whatever else, I wonder if it's because they have, and I know I can do this too, so I'm not just pointing fingers here, but they've gotten in a single lane of the church, which is this system of congregationalism or denominationalism. And unlike you, they're not engaged in their community, or they're not giving time for their family, or they have no hobbies or friends. In other words, you gotta see that the church is moving, even if it's not moving in this one area. There's 4 or 5 other places. Correct. That God's doing something. And well, if God's not there, I'll go over here for a while and not only participate in his mission, but also get filled up with the joy that flows from it, right?
Yeah, amen. And I think a lot of times in the church, we function with it's like a fixed system. It's a closed system. And so we just keep looking around and saying, we've got the same resources, the same this, and this, when God is doing all this other work that we can be invited into. Are we willing to see it is a different question. Right. But yeah, I agree with you. If you have your identity in a variety of places and not just solely in the success of this one thing, that's, I think, critical.
Yeah. So your professional identity is connected with the Lutheran Foundation of St. Louis and Send Me St. Louis. By the way, Shepherd family, if you want to go and learn about what is happening in the Lutheran Foundation or Send Me St. Louis, you can follow the links on the bottom of the screen right now. I will tell you this. I served on the board of the Lutheran Foundation for a number of years, and Ann Vasquez, its president, and the board of directors. I have never been more privileged to serve on a board of directors than that. It is just one of the most well-run, well-governed nonprofit granting agencies you could ever want to see. And especially the way that they evaluate success in nonprofit ministry is both graceful, gracious, and generous, but also hard as nails. And that's what makes it fun. Yeah. So Matt, talk a little bit. What's going on with Send Me these days? What are your emphases? What's different today than 5 to 8 years ago when you started? Kind of what's happening in your leadership? Sure.
So Send Me's main 2 focuses are all things community engagement and all things volunteer management. On the community engagement side, we continue to push more and more into addressing more relational approaches to engaging the community. And so we see a shift away from the church organizing a program to serve the community to the church equipping individuals or small groups of people to engage their neighbors. And so we see that shift, and we're trying to work on how do we support churches. We also do a lot of work with churches that are doing poverty alleviation or Christian community development, which gets more towards how do we not just meet needs, but how do we actually look at the systems that might be broken. So we're doing a lot there. And then right now we're doing a lot on race. and racial injustice. So we're leading a book study on this book called The Color of Compromise. I have that right here. The truth about the American church's complicity in racism. So we'll see how that goes. It's a hard-hitting book and topic, but we feel the need to keep pushing deeper on some of these underlying issues that the church they need to confront. We have to have a robust and safe conversation about it. So we keep growing in those ways. And then also looking for ways to build relationships amongst our network. And Scott, you're familiar with some of that work of gathering people for dinners and larger convenings and bringing thought leaders to the table to ignite imagination. So yeah, we keep getting creative. COVID's forced us to be more creative as well. So yeah, it's an ongoing evolution.
I want to pick up on two threads. One is kind of what you hinted at, which is moving from a toxic charity standing point or posture, I guess I'd say. So I want to talk about toxic charity for a second. And the second thing I want to talk about is just the idea of conversing about race in the church. So because I think aside from whatever position you take, it's the very conversation about race and racism that it saddens me as a pastor. And so I just want to talk about your experience of that, because you're brokering in your professional work, you're brokering some of this conversation, and therefore, the wall tearing down that is so important, especially in the St. Louis community. But first of all, just talk about that repositioning of how churches are engaging their community from toxic charity, and maybe talk a little bit about what toxic charity is, to one that is equipping people who actually live and work and are giving their effort charitably into their communities of which they're a part. Just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, toxic charity essentially is the idea that churches and nonprofits have been really good at a very transactional way of serving, giving food, giving clothing, in a way that creates dependency and doesn't have a long-term vision for flourishing for that individual or for that community. So we will do a food pantry, which has value, but we will only measure success by how much food we gave away and not ask the deeper questions about the long-term trajectory of those individuals' lives. So toxic charity and When Helping Hurts is another book on that. So there is a shift towards thinking more deeply, but it's a highly relational strategy and requires a more robust toolkit that the church has not often had. So there's a lot of growth that needs to happen there and that we're working on, because it's much easier to give things, and it often makes us feel good. That's another marker of toxic charity, that it sometimes becomes more about us as the giver and less it's about the individual provided to. So that's the toxic charity side of the house.
Yeah. And you've got to really, again, I'll just speak from my own experience over 25 years, not just in St. Louis at my congregation there, but through my two prior congregations and even the current one I'm in right now here at Shepherd Scottsdale. It's a big turn. You're turning a warship essentially in reframing how are we going to do mission and ministry, and how do we get skin in the game and really bear the witness of Christ in service and in evangelism to people that we're actually going to see tomorrow out on the street, our next door neighbor, and not just someone in a faraway exotic place. Well,
and I think one of the other things we've been learning quite a bit about is that to go down this path requires a much more collaborative approach, and a level of humility on the part of the church. So if you're going to begin to have a more robust engagement strategy, you are going to need partners, because the church is not gifted to do everything that will be required to engage the community. So how does the church recognize this is how God has gifted us, but I need to X, Y, all these nonprofits or other churches or secular, or the business community. So it does require a much more, a breadth of knowledge for the church to kind of fully engage. But yeah, it is, I like your image. It is turning a ship. And so there's both some theological work, there's some paradigm shifting work, there's some learning about your community work. So it's a whole kind of a whole kit and caboodle.
Yeah, I think that at Shepherd here, I'm getting ready to stand up a class with our congregation regarding, how do you actually talk to your community?
Yeah.
You've lived there. You have had neighborhood picnics. But how do you engage spiritually your community in a way that makes sense for them and is also accessible for you? Boy, just big ticket items. Let's turn the question to the other, or this conversation to the other question, and that is, generational divides are a significant factor. But how is it that you're seeing? Let me ask this. It's a observational question. How are you seeing churches in a very racially tense city like St. Louis? How are you seeing churches recalibrate the way that they engage a mixed race community like St. Louis? What are you seeing in terms of the reframing of Christian approach to friends and neighbors that are not the same color as you?
So I think two things that initially come to mind are listening, so leading with listening, and the church learning to listen to those that are most impacted by the division. So instead of the church assuming this is the solution or I know what's happening, being willing to listen to the experiences of those that have been more negatively impacted by some of the racist history of the city. And so we are seeing, I think, a different willingness to pause, to listen, and to exercise humility and admit you don't know as a way to enter more deeply into the conversation. So I think that's good. The other thing we are seeing that I think is different is a willingness to stand in solidarity with people that are more impacted. So whether that's marching in a protest or finding other ways to show your solidarity and your support, it does feel different right now in the churches that we're working with. Now, there are plenty of confusing things happening with how our churches are trying to engage this topic, or they're not engaging it. We've convened groups to talk about it, and it is complicated. And where the church probably should be the safest place to talk about this, it isn't. And there's a whole slew of reasons why that probably is. But how can we as the church move towards being, hey, we can hold these opinions in tension, and there's grace and forgiveness, and you don't have to have it all figured out, but let's enter into it. So those are some assorted thoughts on that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And just again, for our Shepherd family, who may not be familiar with St. Louis, literally in St. Louis, you could live on one block in the city, or city county. You could live on one block, and you go 5 blocks in one direction, and you are immediately in some of the poorest, and just totally different racially, economically, socially. You could be in a virtually different city. And by the way, you go another 5 blocks and you're out of that in something totally different. St. Louis is, just a very unique town. But in some ways it is the microcosm of intensity with which we're having these national conversations right now. That's why I'm so interested in how Matt is seeing things in St. Louis, because it's just a very unique city, just so you have some background on my interest point in that. So Matt, you're leading, you're raising a family, you're getting ready to send your youngest in a kindergarten here. Well, not super soon, but you're getting there. How old is she, by the way?
She will be 4 in November. So she started pre-K 3 a couple weeks ago now.
Yeah. So let's just get it heartwarming for a second. We talked about some pretty heavy stuff. What are you learning as a parent these days?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah. I told you I would never put you on the spot, but here it is. Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? I mean, who would have thought?
Yeah, I mean, the concept of reasoning with a 3-year-old is interesting, and giving options and discipline. I don't know. That's a good question, Scott. More often than not, I'm just humbled by the fact that she is so smart that my logic doesn't work with her often. So she knows exactly what I'm doing when I'm trying to get her to do something. So we're working through that. But no, she's a treat still.
Wow, it's awesome. Well, hey, I'll get you out on this question, Matt. Let's wrap up, and just final thoughts, final words. And especially, what's the encouragement that you'd give for our Shepherd family, and recognizing that our Shepherd family reaches not just here in Scottsdale, Phoenix, but we've got winter guests and friends of our Shepherd family that are part of our Shepherd family really around the nation. And in fact, in Africa, in Asia, we've down in South America. I mean, the reach of this podcast is phenomenal. I mean, what's the, for wherever you're planted, wherever God is inviting you to bloom, speak out of your experience. What's the encouragement for their community and their life in that community?
Yeah, I think I'd summarize it with the hope is the belief in that we belong to a different kingdom. So whether it's racial division or political division, whatever your division is, you can either be formed by that division or you can be formed by the kingdom.
Yeah.
And it's transcendent. It allows us to be in relationship with a diverse group of people. It allows us to engage in a debate and a conversation where our identity is not in winning. It can be on a different level. But we have to realize that we follow a different type of king who has already won. And in the midst of all this brokenness and the heaviness and the weight, somehow there's this new thing happening in the midst. We won't see perfection on this side of eternity, but he will bring it to fulfillment. So we belong to a different kingdom. We have a different type of king. And in dark days like we're having now, I assume everyone that would listen to this needs to hear that as well.
Right. I love it. The overlapping crisis and glimpses of grace thought with which we began this podcast, it comes full circle. And the encouragement that I received from that word is to recognize in this particular crisis, I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to advance the kingdom, but God, by his Holy Spirit, gives me insight and wisdom. Oh, here's another crisis that's overlapping that one. And I do have some clarity about how to live. I may not be ready to participate in the conversation about racism in America, but I've got children or grandchildren that just need Papa and Nana to make a phone call regularly and say, hey, how you doing? I love you and I'm praying for you. Or, fill in the blank of where these opportunities are at, because the kingdom can advance in all these areas, even if in a particular area we're feeling stuck, confused, beleaguered, overwhelmed, and we don't feel like we're powerful to say something. So that's great. Hey, well, Matt, thank you so much for joining this Shepherd podcast. So great to see you again. Yeah, and don't be a stranger. It's Scottsdale in the wintertime is just fabulous. So bring the fam down.
Yeah, we miss you in St. Louis, but we're glad that you're doing well out there.
I love it. Miss you guys down here too. Hey, Shepherd family, thanks again for joining in. Make sure you check out our other ministry resources online at our website, www.shepherd.family. And you can find out a lot of great things that are happening there, particularly what's coming up this September and October, which is what is called the Being Challenge. We're going to be taking a discipleship tool written by my good friend, Zach Zender, who has authored over 100,000 copies of the book, The Red Letter Challenge. This is his follow-up edition, and it's called the Being Challenge. We're going to learn what it means to be like Jesus, to live like Jesus lived his life before his heavenly Father and in the presence of his disciples. That Being Challenge starts on September 20th weekend, and we're going to be launching a whole bunch of small groups. You can find more out about that Being Challenge. Again, www.shepherd.family. That's our website. And again, any financial support you can offer for this digital ministry and all the things we do as a Shepherd ministry here in Scottsdale and across the globe, that financial support will be much appreciated. Matt, thank you very much. This is Pastor Scott Seidler, and I look forward to seeing you again real soon.